Hey,
How are you?
I am well, thank you.
It's great to see you.
It's nice to
Um,
see you again.
for the benefit of our watchers, most of whom know me, but I'll just share Kathleen Mulligan, co-director of the NLLI, and you can introduce yourself.
I'm Mark Lauritsen. I'm the International Vice President and Director of the United Food and Commercial Workers Food Processing and Meatpacking Division.
All right. And people probably don't know that you and I were both in NLLI year 2 together, and that you are the official arbiter of all disputes. So would you say that year 2 was the best year?
Was no doubt year 2 was the best year. So that debate that you've been having for all these different shows that you've had, it's now settled. So you can say year 2
Okay.
was the best.
Okay. All right. I'm going to
I
reference this as it comes up.
I expect it will not come up again.
Okay. I'll keep you posted on that. So I was so excited to have you on, first because I was just really happy to get to connect with you again and hear how you're doing. But also because, at least where I live in the Midwest, meatpacking is a huge industry of which you are that's part of your jurisdiction. And the sort of prevalence of the COVID hotspots being in meatpacking plants across the Midwest is just unavoidable. And in fact, here it's like in the daily news what's happening. So I was hoping we could talk to you a little bit about what you're seeing, what your members are experiencing, and like what should the rest of the labor movement know about how meatpacking and food processing workers are experiencing the crisis. And maybe we could start, you could just tell us a little bit about who you represent, like who are your members and like facilities that you're working in.
So in our union, we have about 250,000 members that work in food processing and meatpacking. So it'd be all the brands that you would assume you would know, like Tyson, but then the brands that you don't know, JBS, Cargill, National Beef, any major meat packer, but then the food processors like ConAgra, Kraft, and those companies as well. That all falls under there. So it's anything that you're putting in your mouth to eat is probably manufactured and processed by our members.
And why are these like such big COVID hotspots?
Well, I think if you look at it, the meatpacking plants, when you have, especially our larger ones, where you may have 3,000 people under one roof, they really have become like stationary cruise ships. And as you look at a cruise ship, you know that once a virus gets inside a cruise ship, it can just take off just really quick. And I think that's the challenges that we've had, is that because they are like these huge stationary cruise ships, once the virus gets inside of it, it was just hard to contain early in the process. And I think early in the process is where the disconnect came and caused such issues. And now you look at, no matter where you find a meatpacking plant, it almost is assured that you're going to have a COVID hotspot, not just in the Midwest, but literally anywhere across the country.
Yeah. What I remember you telling me about the first outbreak in Milwaukee, which made local and I think national news, is that it was the union that ended up doing the contact tracing and helping to figure out like where the outbreak started and then what needed to happen to help everyone be safe. So can you just tell us more about that? Like, are you doing that everywhere? And then what are the things that you're advocating for or fighting for inside the plants to make it safer for workers?
So early in the outbreak, and this, I mean, it feels like forever ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. Information did flow a lot more freely from health departments, states, the governments, to the employer and to the union. And so we were able to, early on, we were able to look at situations and say, okay, we know that this employee has contracted COVID-19, and then we were able to track down who was within, at the time of CDC's guidance, within a close proximity, which was 6 feet, for an extended period of time, which, like in your part of the country, the Milwaukee Health Department considered that 10 minutes. So we were able to work with management to identify who that was. In fact, it was our stewards and our activists on the shop floor actually knew better who was in close contact than management would have with these people. And we were able to get them off on a quarantine so they didn't further spread the virus. And it was something that you really, at that point, you could really learn that, your rank and file activists and shop floor stewards really do know more than management does about what goes on the plant floor.
For sure.
because they would, they would forget that, oh yes, they also do this in the day and they do that in the day. So they get around to all these different people. And early on, we were able to negotiate with the employers that anybody that did fall into that category that needed to be quarantined, that they were sent home with pay, for that 14-day period, which really did actually helped, because people weren't afraid to be identified because they knew that there wouldn't be a financial hit that they would have to take. So early on, our stewards really became good contact tracers.
And then I'm sure Milwaukee is not the only place where plants have shut down for a while. And so what's the bare minimum that you're asking for before a plant comes back open? Or what's like the retrofitting inside of a shop that makes members feel like, okay, we feel like we can come to work safely again?
Well, if you look at what we're trying to do, is work at this with they call the hierarchy of controls, right? So we start with trying to do things to move, first re-engineer the job, to make the job so you don't need the PPE. You can just re-engineer the job. But in these cases, in these meat plants, and everybody has probably seen pictures by now, that can be difficult. So, if we can't re-engineer the job, then we'll try to move it to the next step, which was what other things can we do to mitigate the exposure and the risks to the employee. Maybe it's things like proper and better ventilations, the physical distancing, those type of things that we put into place. And then at the very end of it is PPE in the hierarchy control. But given the plant situation, we do try to, it's not try now, it's what we demand is that we have after we exercise all the different hierarchies in the control system, then we go to PPE. And so to work in a plant now, you have to have a face mask. You have to have a face shield. The employer needs to erect barriers. So now instead of working at a large table, everybody's basically working in a small cubicle.
Strange.
And then we work. And this was all early on with the enhanced sanitation that takes place. But then we really had to focus on the common areas.
Yeah.
Because you got to remember, these plants were built, years ago. Some of them 100 years ago, and they were just built onto and added onto and added onto. So the common areas were not built and engineered for thousands of people. They were engineered for 300 or 400 people. So we had to work with the employers and demand that they then start staggering breaks, staggering start times, adding additional cafeteria and locker room space. So if you go by any meatpacking plant now, you'll see extra outbuildings that have been built for cafeteria space and locker room space, so we could spread people out and get that physical distancing in the common areas, because the common areas were just as likely to transmit the virus as was the production floor.
Sure. And I'm sure, you and I didn't talk about this before, but even when you were saying that the stewards know more than anyone else, it reminded me that, the stewards are also know who carpooled together or who has a social life together, and how that might affect like what's happening in the workplace.
Yeah, we have an awful lot in our plants because a lot of them aren't in Milwaukee. They're in small rural communities.
Yeah.
So there's housing has always been an issue. So a lot of the people live miles away from the plant, and they do. It's not even fair to call it carpooling, because you'll have, somebody that works at the plant will go out and invest money and buy a large 18-seat van, and then take 18 coworkers to work with him to save from having to drive 40 miles one way. They all get together and carpool in a big van. Again, another spot of transmission that we had to work on mitigating, that of course our stewards knew about. And we had some employers that, because of the distance, they actually have the employers actually charter buses to take people. So we had to figure out how to physically distance inside those buses, make sure the buses were sanitized and cleaned, and take care of the members that way, because every one of those was a spot of potential transmission.
It's like rethinking everything related to the workday. What happens from the time people get up and get ready to go to work? What happens when they're there, when they take a break? It's like all of that has to get re-engineered.
Yeah.
So the issue of OSHA has been a big one, and the sort of weird status of OSHA guidance, but nothing mandatory. Can you just talk a little bit about what OSHA is or isn't doing, and what you wish they were doing?
Well, it's easier to say what they are doing because that's nothing. OSHA,
Yeah, oh, I'm laughing, but that's terrible. It's heartbreaking
in
what's
this
happening.
in this in this pandemic, they have absolutely, at least in the meat sector, but I'm sure across the country in all sectors, they've just checked out. They've offered no emergency standards, which they can do. They did it during the H1N1 outbreak, where they issued emergency standards and said, "Here's what you have to do." Instead, they've issued guidance,
Mm-hmm.
and they've even in the guidance, they said these are voluntary guidelines. You don't have to abide by them, and in fact, we're not even going to enforce them. So what we have is the agency that's supposed to protect workers has totally checked out on one of the things that's probably the most dangerous to workers across the country and across all sectors. They've just checked out and basically turned it over to corporations to police themselves. So what we have to do then is circle back with every employer we have under contract and make sure that we at least have some uniform standards of what is and what isn't safe for workers, because OSHA's not doing it. And that would be in the places we represent. So what goes on inside these non-union poultry houses, it would probably scare us all just to figure what was really going on. But they have absolutely done nothing. And therein lies our problem, is not just OSHA, but the federal government is kind of checked out on this entirely, with the exception of the president issuing his executive order to force all the meatpacking plants to stay open regardless of what's going on. And he said in his executive order that they should follow the CDC OSHA guidelines for meatpacking. But the guidelines actually say that these are voluntary; you don't have to do them. So
they can say we've volunteered not to do that, and yet we're in compliance.
Yep. I mean, so there is no compliance on what happens for meatpacking workers. The first line and the last line of defense happens to be the union in this case, and we'll take that job very seriously.
And which is amazing. And thank God the workers that you represent have someone to represent them and to fight for them. And then the flip side of that is we know how many shops aren't organized, and where we don't know if those workers have any protections at all, which is horrible for them, and also horrible for anyone that thinks we should be trying to stop the virus, because it's both that the workers themselves are at such risk, and that as long as we have workers who aren't protected, that means the virus can keep circulating in our communities.
Exactly. And what else the administration has done just to compound and make the matters potentially worse, both on the worker aspect, but on the virus control aspect, is now they have, while everybody's distracted by the virus and the COVID-19 outbreak, the Department of Homeland Security has decided they could issue emergency orders, and they issued an emergency rule to allow for wide open guest workers to come in, take our jobs, because they say, well, there's not enough people working in the meatpacking industry. Well, there was, if you keep them safe.
Mm-hmm.
I always tell people they're always concerned about the food supply chain in the country. If you want to make the food supply chain safe in this country, all you have to do is make those workers safe, and everything will be fine. And they've failed miserably on that job.
And even before this push for guest workers, your workforce more and more is refugee workers. And so what are the issues you're finding in terms of people's immigration status being an issue for how vocal they're able to be, or how much they're able to say refuse to go to work if they feel like it's not safe, or really take a bold stand to protect themselves and their families? How is that refugee status helping or hurting with that?
Again, in our plants, I can tell you that we will aggressively defend our members regardless of their immigration status. But we do have a lot of immigrants, and we do have a lot of refugees in our plants that would, if you go into our plant, it would not be surprising to find 30 to 40 different dialects and languages.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that is, if there's anything out there, I think that really chills refugee and immigrants from speaking up in today's environment is the Trump administration's executive order on what do they call it? Make it if somebody is a ward of the state, or
the public charge,
the public charge executive order. Because if you become a public charge, then they can re-examine your refugee and immigration status. So anybody, if those plants would have closed and they had to go on unemployment, they are technically now a public charge. So people wouldn't advocate for that course of action because they didn't want to become a public charge and just risk the fact that their immigration or refugee status may be put into question. And it's, again, we're going to defend our workforce. One of the things we did to defend against that particular thing was when you see all these plants being closed down for weeks, like the Patrick Cudahy plant up in Wisconsin, one of the things we negotiated with the employers was you had to continue to pay those people while the plant was closed. So there was no public charge the title charge being placed on them. We were able to negotiate with all these different employers that if a plant closes, then they continue to get their 40 hours of pay while they're working, or excuse me, while
they're in quarantine or the plant is closed.
Yeah, either one, both.
Yeah, that's great. I think we're kind of running short of time, so I should wrap up. I want to thank you, first of all, for everything you're doing. And being in a place where meatpacking is like one of the legacy industries in my state, we know how important it has been for working people to find a pathway into the middle class, and then also what happens when that's not safe anymore. So I just really am so thankful for all the organizing you guys are doing and the hard work of like pushing back plant by plant or employer by employer to make sure that what we wish the federal government was doing this work, but we know like this is what we were born for actually, is to fight these hard fights and make sure that working people have a voice. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And a couple of last thoughts. One, I do suspect that UFCW organizers will be awfully busy in the poultry industry when this thing settles down, because I do think the poultry industry has been woefully inept at protecting workers. And then what you said, that your state being a legacy of meatpacking, allegedly you guys have a football team that was even named after. I say allegedly you have a football team. I'm not sure that you.
Okay. I'm not taking that bait. We could go down a long road here because you're from Iowa, right? I'm from Wisconsin, so we have that. We have a lot of rivalries to explore, but let's save that. We'll do that offline when people aren't watching.
Very good.
All right. It's so nice to see you. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you. Thanks.
All right.